Welcome to the Álamos History Association. Today, my topic is Beautiful and Violent, the capital city of the Aztec Kingdom. The presentation today is inspired and informed by a recent prize-winning book, Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs by Camilla Townsend. Townsend, besides being a historian, is a scholar of Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and she used Nahuatl and Spanish sources in writing her book. The word Aztec is usually used to identify the kingdom, and I use the word here, but the people of the kingdom referred to themselves as Mexica, which I also use. Helpful in putting this presentation together are a special issue of the National Geographic, highlighting the city and material found on the internet. Tenochtitlan was the name of the Aztec capital. Here is a rendition of the city before the conquest, painted in 1945 by the great Diego Rivera. You can see that the city, built on an island, had interior waterways. In the forefront of the picture is one of the causeways that connected inhabitants with the lake shore. Here's a view of the entire island, found at Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology. And here is a rendition of the island's Temple District, published in the National Geographic in 1980. At the center of the picture is the Templo Mayor, a great pyramid with two temples at the top, one for the rain god, painted with blue stripes, and one for the Mexica protector god, painted red. A representation of the rain god, Tlaloc, is seen on this pot. Here is another representation of Tlaloc. The Mexica protector god and god of war was Huitzilopochtli. He wielded the fire serpent as a weapon. Other temples, including to the god of the sun, wind, and learning, and the god of providence associated with jaguars, were built near the Templo Mayor. Here is a model of the Temple District at the Mexico National Museum of Anthropology. The most powerful Aztec kings left impressive architectural remnants of their reigns in the city center. There were gardens in the city, including the grand gardens of the king. Mexico's most gorgeous flowers blossomed amid trees whose fascinating shapes could make them appear enchanted. Admirable also were the gardens overflowing from ordinary people's flat rooftops. Here is a map showing the island in Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico. The island itself was 5.5 square miles. You can see from this close-up towns along the shore of the lake. They were also splendid. A Spaniard named Bernal Diaz wrote of his impressions many years later, describing the Spaniards' first approach to the lake in 1519, seeing not only Tenochtitlan, but the towns on the shore. These great towns and pyramids and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. That was indeed Some of our soldiers asked if it were not all a dream. Everything was shining with lime and decorated with different kinds of stonework and paintings, which were a marvel to gaze on. I stood looking at it and thought that no land like it would ever be discovered in the whole wide world. Diaz added, "Today, all that I saw is overthrown and destroyed. Nothing is left standing." The conquest of the Aztec kingdom occurred between 1519 and 1521, led by Spanish and indigenous forces under the command of Hernán Cortés. The city was destroyed in 1521, and European-inspired buildings began to be built in what became the capital city of New Spain, Mexico City, under imperial rule. Tenochtitlan was founded in the mid-1300s by Mexica people who, like many other groups, spoke the Nahuatl language. The city grew relatively rapidly and was planned in execution. It was neatly maintained. Looking at the Tenochtitlan Island on the map, you can see the word Tlatelolco to the north on the island. Tlatelolco was also populated by Mexica people, but it had its own government as a grand marketing center, a fabulous market serving the needs of the 50,000 strong population of the royal island. This is a representation of the market at the Field Museum in Chicago. One part of the market featured luxury goods, gold and silver, turquoise, jade, and other gems, the feathers of exotic birds. Merchants sold these to artisans as raw materials and to wealthy customers as finely crafted textiles and beautiful jewelry. These turquoise pieces, a dual-headed serpent, the goddess of water, and a sacrificial knife, were taken to Europe as booty after the conquest. The folk story of the founding of the city has been told many times. The Mexica, migrating down from the north and looking for a place to settle, were camping when an eagle alighted before them. The eagle had a snake in its beak and was perched on a cactus. They decided that the eagle wanted them to build a permanent town at that spot. Townsend writes, "They were on an island in a great lake, a place no one else had claimed, probably because it was so marshy. There grew in abundance the prickly pear cactus, with its edible fruit being especially nutritious. There were fish to catch, waterfowl to shoot, and edible algae to gather. The Mexica decided that the site could be made to work. Around the edges of the island, they built chinampas, farmable fields built on swampy ground by constructing a basketry-style fence and filling it with earth. Chinampas are then artificial islands that were created by interweaving reeds with stakes beneath the lake's surface, creating underwater fences. A buildup of soil and aquatic vegetation would be piled onto these fences until the top layer of soil was visible on the water's surface. Now on this map, the green represents Chinampas, and you can see that Tenochtitlan is completely surrounded by the green. This is the glyph. This is the glyph of Tenochtitlan. It is the Mexica representation of their city in Nahuatl pictorial writing, showing cactus and a rock. Traditionally, the name Tenochtitlan was thought to come from the Nahuatl Tet, meaning rock, and Nochtli, meaning prickly pear, and was often thought to mean among the prickly pears growing among rocks. Recent scholarship, though, finds the etymology of the name to be unclear. Here is an indigenous map of the city made shortly after the conquest. It shows Tenochtitlan as a microcosm of the kingdom, with the eagle at the city's access, surrounded by nobles and the founding ruler Tenoch, directly to the left of the cactus. Below the cactus, we find a shield and spears denoting the authority of the Aztec lords. To the right of the cactus is a... Can you mute yourself, please?
Response, which is that
What's
how
that?
you take out his
History
air
club.
defenses.
Oh.
You have to attack Russia to take
Is it
out
on
those.
us?
Let's see.
Are you willing to do? Because how do you make the FISO?
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from.
How do you do that?
Turn on the
without
TV
attacking
second.
It's Justin's iPad. Mute. please.
Okay,
Look at it. There's different iterations of
let
those.
me see. I'll ask to,
Over the western part of Ukraine for humanitarian
oh
reasons,
my,
an area of a humanitarian.
okay.
Great. Okay. This is the indigenous map of the city. And below the cactus, we find a shield and spears denoting the authority of Aztec lords. To the right of the cactus is a skull rack used for sacrificial victims. We'll get to human sacrifice later. Under the city on the map are Aztec warriors attacking the temples of rival towns in conquest. The city's wealth and political domination encouraged in-migration, but victory in war also brought captive women to the city, and more wombs birthed more babies. The Chinampas on the outskirts of the city could not support so large a population. Instead, the city folk obtained much of their food from the rural hinterland. Aztec success in warfare made it possible to demand greater amounts of food as tribute. Also, it was economically attractive for people of the Valley Basin to voluntarily bring food to sell in exchange for the artisan craft work which the urban folk were skillful at producing. The city's location on an island in the center of a large lake allowed it to become a great hub of trade, tying together all the peoples who lived near the surrounding lake shores. This is a reconstruction of a neighborhood, Tenochtitlan Market, at the Mexican National Museum of Anthropology. I mentioned that the construction of the city was planned. The buildings ranged along orderly straight streets. Ordinary households consisted of adobe buildings on 3 or 4 sides of the central courtyard. Besides gardens, the flat roofs sometimes held additional small rooms, often used for storage. Generally, each woman had her hearth, whether the women of the house were co-wives or mother-in-law and daughters-in-law. And each one had her own supply of woman's gear arranged in baskets and boxes. This gear included spindles and looms, grinding stones and pots, brooms and dustpans, as well as clothes and jewelry for adults and children. In a prominent location in the home, men kept their own gear hanging on the wall. Their carefully accumulated handmade weapons, battle headdresses, and mementos of war. People sat and slept on thick mats and pillows. There was no furniture. Over the simple structures loomed large neighborhood temples in the form of pyramids, with highly decorated compounds near each of these for the local nobility. Mexica families were groomed into kin-based clans called calpoli, and these in turn were grouped together to form a community with a leader, the whole being called an altepet. Altepets, in turn, were often collected into a greater altepet. Tenochtitlan was the greatest altepet of the Mexicas. The city's 4 quarters, or sub-altepets, were divided along the lines of the calpoli, the clans, in units akin to parishes or wards, each with its own noble families in the midst of commoner families. The commoner families supported the noble families by paying them tribute. They worked in the chinampas or in a craftsman's workshop, while the noble families organized the ward's endeavors. The political organization of Mexica tradition evolved around what has been called a cellular principle. No individual human being was considered to stand alone in life, but existed only in relation to others. Nor did any group exist alone, but rather thrived by virtue of their connections with those who surrounded them. It was understood that harmony among the whole, made up of kin-based clans grouped into altepels, depended on each segment doing its part. Unpleasant tasks, like maintaining a local temple, or clearing weeds away from a lakeshore to form a port, or collecting tribute to turn over to a conqueror. These tasks were rotated between different component parts of a Mexica polity. The Tenochtitlan state had become powerful enough to formalize some of these traditions on a vast scale, but with a twist. They, and no other Mexica polity, was to be the head of this carefully balanced body politic, a position they had fought many battles to achieve. In general, over the years, there had been relatively little tension within the calpolis on the island. Certain families had been more special than other families, so for many generations, that their lineage status was unquestioned. And As in all aspects of life, it was understood that every category of person had an important role to play. There are signs, however, that in later years, the relative peace was threatened more often than it had before. As the nobility brought home increasing numbers of captive women, they had more children. The families of the nobility threatened to become unmanageably large relative to those of the commoners. At this point, the organization of each calpoli was tightened. Each had its own officials charged with storing tribute, with hearing and settling disputes, and organizing public works like the repair of temples. There were separate officials to handle commoners' grievances and those of the nobility, as well as a sort of high court that supervised both. The many markets, the small ones in each calpoli neighborhood, as well as the massive one that had grown up at Tlatelolco on the north end of the island. These were also carefully administered by officials who ultimately answered to the king, Moctezuma, and his council. A Spaniard who saw the market at Tlatelolco 4 days after the Europeans first arrived in 1519 remembered it with a sort of awe. Quote, "We were astonished at the great number of people and the vast quantities of merchandise, and at the orderliness and the good arrangements that prevailed, for we had never seen such a thing before. The chieftains who accompanied us pointed everything out. Every kind of merchandise was kept separate and had a fixed place marked for it. It was not just the courts and the markets that were governed by an increasingly well-defined apparatus. The temples and schools were likewise becoming bastions of a highly organized set of officials. By the time of King Moctezuma, almost all the city's children, boys as well as girls, nobles as well as commoners, were educated in temple-run schools. They entered these boarding schools around the age of 13 and stayed a few years. A girl learned the proper prayers for her marriage ceremony and for daily life. She learned to spin and weave and embroider, if she had not already become adept. And she also learned her duties as a future wife and mother. Every boy studied warfare, unless he had been selected as a future priest or had been born into a merchant family. These two groups aside, every young male had to learn to be a warrior. The Tenochtitlan Mexica's predominant position absolutely depended on their success in battle. There was no room for failure or for doubt if they did not want the surrounding Altepetal polities that hated theirs to rise up against them. The Mexica people of Tenochtitlan had become militarily dominant, partly through forming in 1428 what is called the Triple Alliance. Besides Tenochtitlan, Altepe included in the alliance were the Alcoba people of the Altepet city-state of Texcoco and the Teponic people of the Altepet city-state of Tlacopan. This is the flag of the alliance with Tenochtitlan glyph in the middle. The kings of these city-states ruled as an unofficial triumvirate It is the Triple Alliance people are speaking of when they refer to the Aztec Empire. In the course of the 1400s, Tenochtitlan became dominant militarily. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1519, the lands of the alliance were effectively ruled from Tenochtitlan, while other parties of the alliance had taken subsidiary roles. The alliance waged wars of conquest and expanded after its formation. It controlled most of central Mexico at its height, as well as some more distant territories within Mesoamerica. Aztec rule has been described by scholars as indirect. The Aztecs left rulers of conquered cities in power so long as they agreed to pay semi-annual tribute to the alliance, as well as supply military forces when needed for Aztec war efforts. In return, the imperial authority offered protection and political stability and facilitated an integrated economic network of diverse lands and peoples who had significant local autonomy. The state religion of the empire was polytheistic, worshiping a pantheon that included dozens of deities. Many polities had officially recognized cults large enough so that their deity was represented in the central temple district of Tenochtitlan. The imperial cult was specifically that of the warlike patron god of the Mexica, Huitzilopochtli. In conquered provinces, people were allowed to retain and freely continue their own religious traditions so long as they added the imperial god Huitzilopochtli to their local pantheons. Communal towns and rites in the fifth sun. The people's religion was both violent and beautiful. To thank gods for what they had, they sometimes made an ultimate sacrifice, that of human life. Yet most of the time, they were devoted not to death, but to protecting their people's lives and working toward their future. Human sacrifice has been sensationalized in writing about the Aztecs, overshadowing other aspects of Mexica culture and politics. Townsend tries to put ritual sacrifice in broader context. The three Altepots of the Triple Alliance acquired their victims for sacrifice from people they had conquered in battle. Most prisoners were distributed among the nobility after a battle, but those who'd been taken by a particular warrior were sent to their captor's neighborhood temple for sacrifice. The Mexica, like all their novel neighbors, believed they owed everything to the gods. Quote, "They are the ones who taught us everything," their priests later explained to the Spanish. "Before them, we kiss the ground, we bleed, we pay our debts to the gods, offer incense, make sacrifices. We live by the grace of the gods." Townsend writes, quote, "The ritual of sacrifice itself seems to have been a gravely quiet, spellbinding experience for the onlookers, much as it probably was in other old worlds, like that of the ancient Celts. The people who watched had fasted, and stood holding sacred flowers. In the early decades of Tenochtitlan, when the Altepet was still gathering strength, only a few people would have been sacrificed on the monthly religious festival days, and they were treated as a holy of holies before they died. After a sacrifice, the warrior who had captured and presented the victim kept the hair and ceremonial regalia of the victim in a special reed chest in a place of honor. Traditionally, every month in the Nuevas ceremony calendar had seen sacrificial victims die. But by the end of Moctezuma's reign, more were killed in Tenochtitlan. A significant number of priests had to have worked full-time, preparing for, orchestrating, and then cleaning up after the deaths. They cleaned the skulls and plastered them into great skull racks. They no longer killed only specially dressed impersonators of a god, but also a variable number of ordinary captives. Only a few days earlier, Mexica society could not possibly dedicate so much time, power, and psychic energy to the rituals of death, but their strength enabled them to do so by the later decades, and their leaders were convinced that if they could do so, they should, as they believed the practice reduced distant Altepets to abject terror. There was definitely an underside to the controlled, well-oiled workings of the beautiful city. Leaders of the Altepets learned from an early age that a good leader was a responsible leader, one who avoided battles he was likely to lose. He preserved his people's lives in order to protect the future of the Altepet. An impetuous leader could be referred to derogatively as a child. Next week, as we consider the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan, we will look at the behavior of King Moctezuma in this light. Our main focus, however, will be on the slave woman Malinche, who played an important role for the Spanish. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you, Pam. Wow. Oh, when I hear all of the history, you know, of Tenochtitlan and Mexico City, I feel sad, but I also at the same time, I feel so enlightened. I wanted to ask you a question about education, Pam. Was there a written language, you know, of the
Okay. The Nahuatl language was written in glyphs, these pictorial representations, but there were aspects to the language which suggested there was also some kind of a phonetic character. That's been recently discovered. After the conquest, when the Franciscans and the Dominicans and the Augustinians came in, they learned the language, some of them, and they wrote it in Roman script. And Mexicas learned the Roman script. So they started writing after the conquest the history and the anthropology and the theology of their people in this Roman script of Nahuatl. So now scholars in recent decades, in North America have been learning to read both the glyphs and the Nahuatl Roman character script, and they're writing the language of the Mexicas from these documents. For a long time, all that we had were what the Spanish had written, Hernando Cortés's letters back to the king, missionary reports and things like that. So what Camilla Townsend has done in her book is it's based partly on her own research, but she's also brought together and reported in her book the research of other scholars who've used Nahuatl language sources. And her book is written in a very reader-friendly fashion. And it won an award, the Kundal Prize, which is given out every year in Canada, given for historians who've written the year before a book which is accessible to an ordinarily educated audience.
That is so interesting. I had another question. I know others of you have questions, but I wanted to ask again. You mentioned in there that all of the boys had to learn warfare. They were trained. The girls primarily home, taking care of the home and whatever else. But you mentioned about merchant families, and it made me wonder if the merchant family, children had to remain merchants. Like, for instance, in Japan, we have the 4 classes of society. If you were born a samurai, you were always, well, was there something like that? Or I just picked up on that, what you said.
The impression I get from Townsend is that if you were born into a merchant family and you were a male, you became a merchant. Because of the widespread trade throughout the Aztec area, it was necessary to have people who were trained in procedures of trade and accounting. And in fact, some towns in the domain were specified as trading towns and would not be affected by war. So because they felt it was necessary, even in times of warfare, to maintain trading activities.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, Susan.
Well, I have a question mentioning the trade. I missed parts because our internet went out, so maybe you already discussed it. But how far afield did they go with the trading? Was it just within their area and other tribes, or did they really expand beyond that area?
Well, my guess is, I don't know, and she doesn't say, but my guess is that trade and expansion somewhat went together. But I did show a picture of the extent of the empire or the kingdom. It's not clear what one should call it, actually. And it covered a wide area, including in Mesoamerica, south of Central America. And I believe there were also market towns kept there as well. So these market towns could be in non-Nahuatl speaking areas.
Okay, I missed that part. Our thing went out totally. I may look at the recording after to catch up.
Very good. Other questions? Barbara?
Yes, following up on that, I'm just wondering if other empires like the Incas came into contact at all with the Aztecs. Were there archaeological findings of trading elements across these larger empires as far down as South America, or?
Not that I read about in this book, and that's the extent of my knowledge, just what Townsend has written. I wouldn't be surprised if there was evidence of objects having gone long distances beyond the borders of the different political domains. I wouldn't be surprised at all, but she doesn't write about that. That would be in archaeological reports.
Mhm.
Well,
Ellen?
I've been to Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and it seemed to me that there was influence maybe from the Aztecs, I'm not sure, because in Chaco Canyon, they also had the ball courts that they had in, I think, in the Aztec Empire. But I think they did go north.
Well, the ball courts were also defined in the Mayan civilization,
Mhm.
which was a long time before the Aztecs. I mean, the Mayans range up to 1200 AD, but they started, I think, in about 200 or 300 AD. They had ball courts as well. I don't know if the Olmecs did or not. I can't remember.
One thing near, not that far from Álamos, is Nuevas Casas Grandes in Chihuahua. I don't know if any of you have been there. I visited there once, and that was kind of the center of trade from going south up. And this really has piqued my interest on, the early history of what is now Sonora, Chihuahua, and Sinaloa, and what relationship there was between life here, trade, etc., and religion too, down to the Aztecs. So
Well, there's also Casa Grande in Arizona.
yeah, well, that's true, but Nuevas Casa Grandes was kind of a market center. There was a great deal of trade there.
Pottery.
Yeah. Okay, more questions. Other questions coming up? Well,
No question, but thank you. It's very interesting.
oh, thank you, Pam. Every time I hear, Bernal Diaz del Castillo and that great book, I feel bad that when I was at my university study, my high school, whatever, I never really had any of this until I started studying the Spanish language. And that's what opened me up to the history of Mexico. And the Bernal Diaz book was one of the first things that I read, and it just excited me about what had happened. Like I say, I have a sadness, but yet an appreciation for the history. Okay, if there's nothing else, yeah, go ahead.
I have a suggestion, Errol. After everyone else has gone off, maybe we could do the beginning of the talk again, and you could splice it together.
You betcha I can. Let's do that. And so anyway, that way when you see the final product, you'll have both put together there. So I apologize again. You guys are supposed to help me out with this. You know that I often forget to record. Okay, well, goodbye for now. Pam and I are going to stay online. The rest of you have a wonderful Thursday, and we'll all look forward to being at Álamos again soon. And some of you are already there. Okay, bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.